Amelia felt a strange sense of detachment as the limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the Everwood, the most exclusive hotel and wedding venue in the state. The familiar scent of jasmine and cypress trees, a combination she had personally chosen, wafted through the open window, but it brought little comfort. Today she was not the owner, the mind behind every curated detail, from the Italian marble floors to the hand-blown glass chandeliers that glittered like captured stars. Today she was just Amelia, Tiffany's cousin, a guest at a wedding where she already felt like an outsider. She had dressed simply, in a modest navy blue dress that was elegant but understated. She knew her cousin's taste for opulence and display, and the last thing Amelia wanted was to be accused of trying to upstage the bride. Her relationship with Tiffany had frayed over the years, stretched thin by diverging paths and values. They were once inseparable, two girls building forts out of blankets and dreaming of the future. But while Amelia had poured her grief and a modest inheritance from her parents into building a business from the ground up, quietly and diligently, Tiffany had poured her energy into climbing the social ladder, her worth measured in brand names and influential friends. Her aunt, Tiffany's mother, greeted her at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Amelia, darling, you made it. We weren't sure you'd be able to get away from, well, whatever it is you do." The backhanded comment was delivered with a light, airy tone, a signature of her aunt's passive aggression. "I wouldn't miss it, Aunt Carol," Amelia replied, her voice even. She moved past her into the grand foyer, her gaze sweeping over the scene. The floral arrangements were breathtaking, a cascade of white roses and peonies that she knew cost a small fortune. Her staff had outdone themselves. A flicker of pride warmed her chest, a feeling quickly extinguished by a cold knot of anxiety. As she approached the seating chart, an ornate mirror with names written in beautiful gold calligraphy, she scanned the list. Her heart sank. There, at the very bottom, was her name. Amelia Vance, Table 23. Table 23. She didn't need to see the floor plan to know where it was. It was the table tucked away in the back corner near the swinging doors to the kitchen, the one reserved for distant relatives, plus ones of friends and other guests of perceived lesser importance. It was a deliberate, calculated slight. From here, she would have a perfect view of the servers coming and going, but a very poor view of the head table where Tiffany and her new husband, Brian, would sit like royalty. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. She had expected something like this, but the reality of it was still a sting. She saw Brian's family, wealthy and boisterous, being ushered to the tables at the front, their laughter echoing through the hall. She saw Tiffany's friends, all draped in designer clothes, taking their seats at other prime tables near the dance floor. And then, there was her, relegated to the shadows. She made her way to the back, her steps feeling heavier with each one. The opulent ballroom, a space she had designed to be a canvas for joyful memories, felt alienating. She passed by the bar, a long, sweeping curve of polished mahogany she had sourced herself, and resisted the urge to check the alignment of the bottles. She noticed a slight watermark on one of the floorboards near the west terrace, making a mental note to have maintenance look at it on Monday. Old habits died hard. When she reached table 23, she found it occupied by a few other people who looked as uncomfortable as she felt. A distant great-uncle who was half asleep, and the parents of one of Brian's college friends. They offered polite, watery smiles, and Amelia sat down, the rhythmic swoosh of the kitchen doors already beginning to grate on her nerves. A young server, a new hire named Chloe she had briefly met during training, approached the table. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink?" "Just water for now, thank you, Chloe," Amelia said with a small smile. The girl's eyes widened for a fraction of a second in recognition, a flicker of surprise that she quickly masked with professional poise. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her voice dropping a respectful octave. Amelia knew her secret was safe. The staff at the Everwood were nothing if not discreet. It was a cornerstone of their training. They were trained to handle celebrities, politicians, and billionaires. A secret owner was well within their capabilities. Amelia leaned back in her chair, the muffled sounds of celebration washing over her from a distance. From her vantage point, she could see Tiffany, a vision in white, laughing and holding court. She looked happy, radiant even, and for a moment, the sting of the insult faded, replaced by a genuine, if distant, feeling of affection. Despite everything, she was still her cousin, the little girl who had shared her secrets and dreams in a blanket fort all those years ago. Amelia was prepared to endure the night in silence, a ghost at the feast, content to watch from the sidelines. She had no idea that the evening was about to take a very different turn. The first course was served. From her distant table, Amelia could see the flurry of synchronized servers placing plates of seared scallops before the guests at the front. It was a culinary ballet she had personally choreographed with her head chef, Jean-Pierre. A few minutes later, a different, less experienced server brought plates to table 23. The presentation was sloppier, and the scallops were lukewarm. The great-uncle poked at his with a fork, grumbling under his breath, while the other couple ate in resigned silence. Amelia ate hers without complaint. It was edible, just not perfect. But the imperfection felt symbolic of the entire evening. The main celebration felt like a distant shore, and they were on a small, forgotten island. The swinging kitchen doors became a source of constant disruption. A burst of clanging pots, a snippet of a shouted order, a rush of air. It was precisely why this table was the least desirable in the entire room, and Tiffany and her mother had placed her here. It wasn't just neglect, it was a statement. Halfway through the main course, a filet mignon that, to Amelia's relief, was cooked perfectly even at her table, a minor disaster struck. A busboy, rushing out of the kitchen, failed to see a server coming the other way. There was a loud clatter as a tray of champagne glasses crashed to the floor just a few feet from their table, sending shards of glass skittering across the marble. Guests at nearby tables turned to look, their faces a mixture of annoyance and pity for the occupants of the bad table. The busboy, a teenager named Leo who looked mortified, immediately began to stammer apologies. The floor manager, who should have been overseeing this section, was nowhere in sight. Aunt Carol materialized at the edge of the scene, her face a mask of theatrical dismay. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Amelia, as if this disruption was somehow her fault. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "What a mess. You must be used to this sort of chaos, Amelia, sitting back here. It's a completely different world from the front." The jab was sharp and public. Amelia felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. Before she could formulate a reply, she saw the fear in young Leo's eyes. He looked like he was on the verge of tears, convinced he was about to be fired on the spot. Instinct took over. Amelia stood up, her simple navy dress suddenly feeling like a uniform of authority. She placed a calming hand on Leo's arm. "It's all right, Leo," she said, her voice low but firm. "Accidents happen. Just get a broom and a dustpan. We'll have this cleared in a moment. Make sure you get every piece." Then she turned to the stunned server whose path had been blocked. "Maria, please get a fresh tray of champagne. And when you come back, please inform Mr. Dubois that I'd like to see him." The authority in her tone was unmistakable. Maria, a seasoned waitress, simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Right away." Aunt Carol stared, her mouth slightly agape. "Mr. Dubois? The hotel manager? Amelia, what are you doing? Don't make a scene. You're just a guest." "I'm helping," Amelia said calmly, turning her back on her aunt to help direct the cleanup, ensuring no guests were near the broken glass. She felt a strange shift inside her. The pretense of being just a guest had shattered along with the champagne glasses. This was her house. These were her people, and she would not stand by and watch them flounder, nor would she tolerate a young employee being humiliated for a simple mistake. A few minutes later, a tall, impeccably dressed man with silvering hair hurried toward the back of the ballroom. This was Jean-Luc Dubois, the general manager of the Everwood, a man Amelia had personally headhunted from a five-star hotel in Paris. His expression was one of deep concern. "Madame Vance," he said, his voice a low, respectful murmur as he reached her. He completely ignored everyone else at the table, including Aunt Carol, who was still lingering nearby. "I was just informed. I am so sorry. Is everything all right? Are you hurt?" Amelia gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm perfectly fine, Jean-Luc. Leo had a small accident. He was shaken, but he handled it. I was just concerned about the lack of immediate management supervision in this section." Jean-Luc's gaze hardened almost imperceptibly as he scanned the area. "It will be addressed. Immediately. Is there anything at all I can get for you? A new table, perhaps? We have a private suite overlooking the gardens that can be prepared in minutes." It was a tempting offer. A quiet escape from the noise, the judgment, and her aunt's withering glare. But she shook her head. "No, thank you, Jean-Luc. I am a guest at my cousin's wedding. This is the table I was assigned." She made sure to look directly at Aunt Carol as she said it. The implication was clear. "As you wish, madame," he said with a slight bow. "But if you require anything at all, you have only to ask. I will be personally monitoring the service for the rest of the evening." He cast one last sharp glance at the kitchen doors before turning and walking away with purpose. The entire exchange had been quiet, but it had not gone unnoticed. The other guests at table 23 were staring at Amelia with newfound curiosity. Aunt Carol's face had paled, a confused and suspicious frown creasing her brow. She clearly didn't understand what she had just witnessed, but she knew it was significant. Why would the esteemed general manager of this exclusive hotel rush to the back table and speak with such deference to her supposedly unremarkable niece? The question hung in the air, a note of discord in the carefully orchestrated symphony of the wedding. The incident with the broken glasses had subtly altered the atmosphere at the back of the room. The service at table 23 improved dramatically. Mr. Dubois was true to his word. A senior waiter, one Amelia recognized as one of her best, was now assigned to their section. Their water glasses were never empty, and when dessert was served, it was presented with the same flair as at the head table. Amelia's table mates, who had previously been quiet and reserved, now regarded her with a mixture of awe and intrigue. The half-asleep great-uncle was suddenly wide awake, and the other couple leaned in, their curiosity palpable. "How do you know the manager?" The woman, whose name Amelia learned was Brenda, finally asked in a hushed tone. Amelia offered a polite, non-committal smile. "Our paths have crossed professionally." Her vague answer only deepened the mystery. Brenda and her husband exchanged a look, clearly speculating. Aunt Carol, who had returned to her own, better-located table, kept shooting suspicious glances their way. Amelia could almost see the gears turning in her mind, trying to reconcile the niece she looked down on with the woman who commanded the instant respect of the hotel's top manager. The wedding speeches began. Tiffany's father went first, followed by Brian's. Then it was time for the maid of honor, Tiffany's best friend, to speak. She gushed about Tiffany's impeccable taste, her ambition, and her talent for networking with the right people. Then came Brian's best man, who told a series of loud, boorish jokes that had his friends roaring with laughter. Throughout it all, Amelia sat quietly, a polite smile fixed on her face. She felt a growing sense of alienation, not just from her cousin, but from the world Tiffany had built around herself, a world that felt transactional and hollow. Then came the moment that changed the entire evening. Brian, the groom, stood up to give his speech. He thanked their parents and the guests. He spoke lovingly of Tiffany, his voice thick with emotion. At the end of his speech, he raised his glass. "And finally," he said, his voice booming through the microphone, "I want to give a very special thank you to the person who made this night possible in this incredible place. We were on a waiting list for 2 years to get a date here, and we were about to give up and book somewhere else. But then my amazing wife worked her magic." He beamed at Tiffany, who preened under the attention. "Tiffany told me she had a connection, a cousin who supposedly worked in the hospitality industry. We were skeptical, of course, but she made a call." Brian scanned the room, his eyes squinting as he tried to find her. "I'm not sure where she's sitting. I think somewhere in the back. Amelia? Amelia Vance? Are you here?" A spotlight operator, following his gaze, swung a bright beam toward the back of the room, finally landing on table 23. It swept across the startled faces of the great-uncle and Brenda's family before settling directly on Amelia. Suddenly, she was no longer in the shadows. She was the center of attention, with hundreds of pairs of eyes on her. The silence in the room was absolute. "There you are," Brian exclaimed. "Everyone, we owe our thanks to Tiffany's cousin, Amelia. Tiffany told us you were, I don't know, a junior event coordinator or something, and that you pulled some strings for us. So, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for getting us a foot in the door at this amazing place. We are so, so grateful for your help." He raised his glass. "To Amelia." A smattering of polite, confused applause followed. Amelia felt her blood run cold. She looked at Tiffany, who was smiling smugly at the head table. This wasn't a thank you, it was a public declaration of her perceived insignificance. A junior event coordinator, a foot in the door. Tiffany hadn't just downplayed her role, she had fabricated a lesser one to make herself seem more influential, as if she had commanded a subordinate to do her a favor. The lie was audacious. Amelia had never received a call from Tiffany. She had seen her cousin's name on the long 2-year waiting list and, in a moment of familial sentimentality, had personally moved the date up, gifting them a cancellation on a prime Saturday. She had told Mr. Dubois to inform them that a spot had opened up, never breathing a word of her involvement. She had wanted it to be an anonymous gift, a silent olive branch. But Tiffany and Brian had twisted it into an assertion of status. They had used her generosity to build their own prestige, while simultaneously relegating her to the worst table in the house. As the applause died down, a new voice cut through the silence. It was Chloe, the young server who had taken her drink order earlier. She was standing near a service station, holding a water pitcher, and her face was flushed with indignation. "She's not a coordinator," Chloe said, her voice trembling but clear in the quiet room. All eyes snapped to her. Mr. Dubois, who was standing near the wall, took a sharp step forward, his eyes wide with alarm. Chloe took a deep breath and continued, her voice growing stronger. "She's not a junior coordinator, and she didn't just get them a foot in the door." She raised her hand and pointed directly at Amelia, who was still frozen in the glare of the spotlight. "That's Ms. Amelia Vance. She owns this hotel. She owns all of it." An absolute deafening silence fell over the ballroom. For a moment, it felt as if no one was breathing. Every single guest, from the boisterous family at the front tables to the bewildered couple at table 23, was frozen. The spotlight was still on Amelia, a harsh, interrogating beam, but all eyes were on the young server, Chloe, who stood trembling but resolute by the service station. Then, as if a spell had been broken, a collective gasp swept through the room. 1,000 tiny movements and murmurs started at once. People turned to their neighbors, whispering frantically. Heads swiveled from the terrified server to the stunned head table, and finally, back to the figure in the simple navy dress who was now, impossibly, the center of this multi-million-dollar universe. At the head table, Tiffany's smug smile had not just faded, it had shattered. Her face, moments before flushed with triumph, was now a ghastly, chalky white. Her eyes were wide with a horror that was quickly curdling into pure, unadulterated fury. She stared at Amelia, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. This was her worst nightmare realized. In a single sentence, her carefully constructed image as a powerful, well-connected socialite had been obliterated in front of everyone she had worked so hard to impress. She hadn't just been caught in a lie, she had been exposed as a fool. Brian, the groom, looked utterly bewildered. He glanced from his new wife's horrified face to Amelia, then back again. The dots were connecting in his mind with painful slowness. The deference from the general manager, the sudden improvement in service, the condescending speech he had just so proudly delivered. He had not been thanking a lowly employee. He had been publicly insulting the owner of the very establishment he was bragging about. The humiliation was dawning on him, hot and sharp. Aunt Carol looked as if she might faint, her hand pressed to her chest, her face a comical mask of disbelief. It was Jean-Luc Dubois who finally took control of the situation. He began to walk calmly from the side of the room toward the center, his polished shoes clicking audibly on the marble floor. He moved with a purpose that drew all attention, a captain steadying his ship in the middle of a storm. He stopped near the dance floor, took a microphone from a nearby stand, and cleared his throat. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative, instantly calming the rising chatter. "It seems a clarification is in order." He turned his gaze, warm and respectful, toward the back of the room where Amelia still sat, bathed in light. "Chloe is correct," he announced, his voice ringing with clarity. "Though it is a fact she has always wished to keep private, the Everwood and its grounds are indeed the sole property of Miss Amelia Vance. She was the visionary who designed and built this estate from the ground up. We, the staff, are merely the proud stewards of her vision." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The only reason Mr. and Mrs. Thompson are celebrating their wedding here tonight is because Ms. Vance, seeing her cousin's name on our extensive waiting list, personally intervened to grant them a date as a private, anonymous wedding gift." The second revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. It wasn't just that they had insulted their benefactor, they had taken her most generous gift and thrown it back in her face with contempt. The murmurs erupted again, this time laced with judgment pointed squarely at the head table. The pity that guests had felt for the woman at the back table was instantly transformed into admiration for her grace and disgust for the bride's cruelty. Amelia finally moved. With a quiet elegance that felt more powerful than any outburst, she stood up. The spotlight followed her. She did not look at Tiffany. She did not look at Brian. Her gaze went first to Chloe, who looked as if she might cry from fear and relief. Amelia gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. Then she looked at Mr. Dubois, a silent thank you passing between them. He had handled the situation with the perfect balance of professionalism and loyalty. She gathered her small clutch purse from the table. Brenda and her husband, her former table mates, stared at her as if she were a queen. The old great-uncle was on his feet, looking at her with newfound respect. With every eye in the room on her, Amelia turned and began to walk toward the grand exit. She walked with her head held high, her simple dress now seeming like a statement of quiet confidence. She didn't rush. Her footsteps were steady and measured on the marble floor she herself had chosen. The crowd parted instinctively before her. Her exit was not a retreat. It was a silent, dignified abdication from the petty drama her family had created. The wedding, her cousin's crowning social achievement, had been irrevocably tarnished, not by a scene Amelia had caused, but by a truth she had tried to conceal in an act of kindness. As the large oak doors swung shut behind her, a stunned and fractured celebration was left in her wake. The moment the grand oak doors swung shut behind Amelia, the spell of shock that had gripped the ballroom didn't just break. It shattered into a million pieces. The ensuing silence was brief, immediately consumed by a tidal wave of whispers that grew rapidly in volume and intensity. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality collapsing in on itself. Every guest, from Brian's boisterous, wealthy family to Tiffany's clique of social climbing friends, now looked at the head table not with envy, but with a kind of morbid fascination. Brian had slumped into his chair, his face a mask of abject horror, his hands covering his eyes as if to block out the disaster he had just helped create. Tiffany was no longer the radiant, triumphant bride. She sat bolt upright, her knuckles white where she gripped the tablecloth, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A single, perfect tear traced a path through her expensive makeup, a silent testament to the ruin of her ambitions. Her wedding, the event meticulously planned to be the crowning glory of her social ascent, had just become the most public and humiliating spectacle imaginable. The first to move were Brian's parents. His father, a stern man who valued reputation above all else, stood up abruptly. He cast one long, withering look at Tiffany, a look that conveyed a universe of disappointment and fury, before turning to his wife. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and guttural. They walked away without a single word to their son or their new daughter-in-law, their departure a clear and brutal severing of ties. Their exit started a chain reaction. The most influential guests, the ones Tiffany had been most desperate to impress, began to stand and make their own quiet, hasty exits. They avoided looking at the head table, their polite murmurs to each other a damning verdict on the evening's hosts. Aunt Carol, seeing her daughter's life's work evaporate before her eyes, made a frantic attempt at damage control. "A misunderstanding," she chirped, her voice unnaturally high. "Just a silly, dreadful misunderstanding." But no one was listening. Her words were a pathetic squeak against the thunder of the truth. Outside, Amelia walked through the cool night air, the distant, chaotic sounds of her own party fading behind her. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt a deep, hollowing ache for the girl who used to be her cousin, the one she'd shared secrets with in a blanket fort. That girl was gone, buried under a mountain of insecurity so vast it had warped her into someone Amelia no longer recognized. She followed a stone path into the heart of the Queen's Garden, a secluded area she had designed in memory of her mother, who had loved white roses. The scent of jasmine and cypress, the very scents she'd chosen for the entrance, enveloped her. This place, the Everwood, was more than a business. It was a sanctuary built from the ashes of her grief, a tribute to the parents who had taught her that true worth comes from character, not from applause. Her walk was interrupted by the sight of Mr. Dubois standing by a fountain, speaking in low, comforting tones to Chloe, the young server who had spoken out. Chloe's face was streaked with tears, her body trembling. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vance," Chloe whispered as Amelia approached. "I couldn't just stand there. I thought I was going to be fired." Amelia stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Fired?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "Chloe, what you did was the bravest thing I have seen in a very long time. You stood up for the truth. That is the very spirit of the Everwood." She looked at Mr. Dubois. "Jean-Luc, please see to it that Chloe is promoted to guest relations supervisor, effective tomorrow, and give her a bonus equal to 3 months' salary. We reward loyalty here." Chloe stared, speechless, as tears of relief and gratitude replaced the ones of fear. Mr. Dubois simply smiled. "It will be my pleasure, madame." Back inside the now half-empty ballroom, the final act of the tragedy was unfolding. Mr. Dubois, having left Amelia in the garden, approached the head table. The remaining family members fell silent as he placed a heavy, leather-bound folder on the table in front of Brian. It was the final itemized bill for the evening, calculated to the last cent. Tiffany's father stared at it. "What is this? There must be a family discount," he started to say. Mr. Dubois' expression remained perfectly neutral. "The gift from Ms. Vance," he stated calmly, "was the wedding date itself, which allowed you to bypass our 2-year waiting list. That gift was valued at a price far greater than this bill. The services and venue, however, were not included." His gaze was unwavering. "The bill is correct. We accept all major forms of payment. The finality of his words was crushing. There was no escape. They had not been guests of honor. They had been full-paying clients who had publicly insulted the owner. The bill was not just a financial transaction, it was a final, stark reminder of their arrogance and the price that came with it. The story of Tiffany's wedding became a cautionary tale whispered in the city's elite circles. Her reputation, and Brian's by association, was irrevocably shattered. They had aimed for the sun but had flown too close. Their wax wings melted not by ambition but by their own cruelty. Amelia never spoke of that night again. She continued to run the Everwood with quiet strength, a leader who was more often found talking with her gardeners than sitting in a boardroom. She understood that true power wasn't in owning things, but in building them. Not in being seen, but in creating places where others could feel truly seen and celebrated. Her legacy was not written in newspaper columns, but in the loyalty of her staff and the silent, enduring beauty of the sanctuary she had built.